Imagine that the government comes to you and says that in 7 days you must vacate your house. What do you do with your property? What do you do with your crops that are in the field? What do you do about your pets?
Fear. Fear, ignorance. 120,000 plus Japanese and Japanese Americans were taken from their families, from their homes, had to leave their businesses.
It was shameful to be in a camp like criminals.
These are American citizens, just like you're an American citizen.
After Pearl Harbor, the government put Japanese Americans into camp under the pretext that it was impossible to tell the loyal from the disloyal. They said, we simply can't tell, so let's just lock them all up.
People were rounded up. They had to go to an assembly center.
Picture someone saying, you have a suitcase and it's only this big. Suitcases now are much bigger, so I always make sure to tell them it's only this big. Someone tells you, you have a day, you have to figure out what you're going to put in that suitcase and you have to leave and you're not sure when you're coming back. And some of them went to a relocation center and then went to, they called them camps.
I didn't learn a lot about it in school, really at all. There was like 3 sentences I think I remember in our textbooks about the internment camps.
And of course now, looking back on it, it's horrible. It's a horrible thing to have happen to any person, let alone an American citizen.
They were told, it's your behavior, it's your remembering your cultural heritage that made you vulnerable to this, when the reality of it was your skin color and the way you looked.
Some people were in camps for 4 years. I mean, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine not knowing where I was going to be for a week, much less years go by.
Oh, here it is. And then there's the door. This was the door. So I can't imagine a family of 6 people living in this little space right here. Down. Coming back here and seeing this is, gosh, I don't know if I have words. It's tragic, you know, as far as what they must have been feeling while they were living here and not knowing what the future held. But it's amazing to think that 7,500 people were compacted into this little area.
Well, immediately after Pearl Harbor, within 24 to 48 hours, the FBI had begun to round up prominent members of the community. President Roosevelt assembled the Roberts Commission and charged the commission with determining what the causes were of Pearl Harbor. One of its most meaningful conclusions was that there had been Japanese spies on the islands in Hawaii, but there was no evidence that Japanese Americans were involved in that spying. Nevertheless, widespread public panic, politicians, the press, and certain business interests, and the military as well, combined to make for a very strong argument against Japanese Americans and their civil rights. It wasn't until February when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that enabled the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. So what we can surmise from that is that the public sentiment was very much, in the West at least, very much in favor of the removal, the incarceration, the imprisonment of Japanese and Japanese Americans.
Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
No matter what, no matter how long they had been in this country, no matter their cultural practices, no matter their ability to speak English or not speak English, no matter their having been educated in United States schools, no matter what, they remained indelibly racially other, which is to say, in the case of Japanese Americans, they remained Japanese loyal to Japan. So in the case of Japanese Americans, many of them conducted fire sales, put up for sale their cars, their farm equipment, their refrigerators, their furniture, and of course got pennies for the dollar.
My family on my dad's side were all imprisoned in the camp. So they had to sell their house, their home, and then they were moved from their home to Santa Anita Racetrack, and they lived there for a number of months in a horse stall. And so imagine that, moving from a house into a horse stall. From there they boarded a train that transported them from LA out to here.
So you're packing in, almost 7,500 people in a very small confined area. Roughly 7,300 and some people at its peak, which for the state of Colorado at that time, it was the 10th largest concentration of people at the time in the state. We are actually in the 12H block barrack that has been reconstructed. This would be a family unit, and anywhere from 10 to 12 individuals would be actually in this room. A light in the center of the room with a pull cord, wooden cots, army cots, one pail, so they could either get water from the bathroom unit or get coal from the coal chutes that are outside for the one potbelly stove that would heat the room. Most of everybody that came to Machi, the majority of them, will be from Southern California, Los Angeles, and Merced County. A lot of the Japanese Americans from Southern California had never even seen snow. And to live through snow in a building that has no insulation with huge icicles hanging off of it. It's a military style camp. You had one mess hall per block. You had 12 barracks on each side of that mess hall. Then you had a laundry unit that had running water. Then you had a bathroom unit. And basically you had 3 stalls. Okay, so it'd be about 125 people per stall on the bathroom units. And they were communal, and of course you didn't have any privacy. You look at some of the individuals that were brought here, you're talking about lawyers, doctors, ministers, very, very professional people. And they went from being very, very successful in Los Angeles, some of them doing very, very, very well, to having to sell everything they own and coming here to lose it all.
So my grandfather had dug a hole somewhere around here and to store my aunt and uncle's baby formula.
It looks like it goes backwards.
I could see that.
Yeah. Oh, that's nuts. That's crazy. That's crazy.
And you had to have. We see a replica of the barrack. We see a The original water tower is back up, has been restored and is back up. We see one of the replica of one of the guard towers that is up.
We're standing on the cemetery here at Amache. Well, there were, I think, 120 people that died at this camp.
So they had hospitals, they had police stations, they had fire departments. So they did everything they could to make this home mindful of the guard tower that is right outside this barrack that was manned by MP units with 50 caliber machine guns and German Shepherds.
Let's see here. This is a picture of the family before. This must be right before we went into the camp. I was born in Los Angeles, California, June 22nd, 1941. I believe my father was born in Washington State and my mother was born in Oregon. And their parents were American citizens also. We've got a good history of citizenship. And we were in the internment camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, before we came to Denver. That's me, and that's my brother, and we're both in the camp by that time. When we left California, I was under a year old, and my brother was, 2.5 years older than I. So my mother had her hands full. And of course, there were no paper diapers. She said that she was very fortunate because she had a wagon and she could put us in a wagon. The other thing that she had was an electric iron. If you remember that sole plate on the electric iron, she said she'd turn it upside down and heat food for me on that sole plate. There weren't many pictures. You know, for a long time, they prohibited cameras in the camp. I must have been close to 4 coming out. I think this was right when we came back, or came to Colorado or to Denver. That was my mom and my brother and I.
Now, over time, Japanese Americans were very resourceful.
There's a Japanese word, it's called gaman. It basically means just deal with the cards that you're dealt and move on and don't make waves. And that's what they did.
Many of them tried to grow gardens outside of their barracks. And they tried to make as normal of a life as possible for the sake of their children. And so within the camps, eventually, there were schools that had classrooms. There were very, very crude medical facilities, and there were mess halls.
And I think a lot of the reason why maybe afterwards people didn't look at it as this huge travesty that it really was because of the resilience of the people who went to the camps. And they went and they knew, okay, we're going to be here, we don't know for how long, so let's set up a school. This is my grandfather, my mom's father, and my mom's mother. This is my mom. She's one of 12. So my mom, her name is Ruby, and she passed away, well, this is hard, 3 years ago. So she was born in California. Both my parents were interned. My mom was at Tule Lake and Topaz. My dad was in Heart Mountain. So we actually have yearbooks from when my dad was at Heart Mountain. Then this is a brochure from the Heart Mountain Relocation Center that my dad just stuck in here. And it tells a little about the camp. And this I found really interesting. The first thing you see is the American flag. So this was when this is the last yearbook before the camp closed, and this is when my dad was a junior. So this is very interesting. All these girls, 2 guys up there, and here's my dad. This was an organization called the Boys League, which I'm not really sure what it is, but that's my dad. And he also, the picture from when he was at played baseball. This is that picture, so he's there. If you look on the other side of it, it is typical teenager when you look at things that people wrote, like you're a swell guy. It says, Doug, may you have the best of luck and happiness. Just a friend, Ruby. It's really interesting, my mom's name is Ruby, but this is not my mom. This is a different Ruby. My mom hadn't met my dad at this point. You know, neither one of them talked about it very much, so every once in a while, my mom would mention, mostly what she would mention was about the lack of privacy. She talked about the weather and how hard it was. But not a lot about other things. My dad really didn't say anything. It was really important for them that we knew about it, but it was just too hard for them to talk about.
For the most part, Japanese Americans entered the camps peacefully and existed within the camps peacefully. But at times their frustrations boiled over into what in several camps became protest riots. Several Japanese Americans were shot and killed by military guards, sometimes because of the unrest in the camps, and sometimes just because they wandered into the wrong place. So the camps were called by the government relocation centers, but they were prisons. There were conditions under which Japanese Americans could leave the camps, but like prisoners being granted parole, they were not free to do so of their own will. And when you ask some of the people who remember this experience, why would they go without protest? There was a very real sense of fear that if they did not cooperate, there would be dire consequences. Fast forward a couple of years, the United States actually began asking for volunteers first and then drafting Japanese Americans out of camp. Now, the vast majority of those drafted out of camp complied, served with incredible bravery.
My dad joined the Army, and he was in for, I believe, 2 years. And when he had an honorable discharge, and he was a sergeant when he left. I think they just wanted to prove themselves in the most unselfish way you possibly could, which is to go to war for a country, even though your family is behind barbed wire. And the guns that are there are pointing in towards your family. And yet these men still went and fought for the United States.
So as justification for the reason why Japanese Americans were imprisoned, the United States offered the following logic. They said that you have been insufficiently assimilated and you have not proven your loyalty to the United States. So when young men volunteered and were drafted and served in the military, many of them saw this as a refutation of that logic. They said, we are proving ourselves to be loyal Americans. The camps were closed in late 1944, early 1945, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that you could not indefinitely hold people in prison on the basis of being a suspected disloyal person. Folks got a railroad ticket, the possessions that they had in camp, and were sent on their merry way. So for many Japanese Americans, returning home to their farms, to their neighborhoods, to their cities, it was a tragic moment. It was a moment of freedom, but also a moment to reflect on how much they had lost.
They got $25 and a bus ticket, and that was what they started their life over with. So they bussed into Denver, taking this desolate road on the bus, not knowing what the future held, you know, and just knowing that they were going to have to restart some way. So it's really, when we drive back, that's a thought that always pops into my head is, what must they have been thinking, you know, on this desolate road from the camp going to Denver. California, they had nothing to go back to. I mean, they lost their house, they lost their store, and so Denver was the place that they needed to go, just because they didn't have anything to go back to. They couldn't afford to go back, and that's the reason why I grew up in Colorado, was because of this historic experience.
You are released from these camps and you don't have any place to go. So one of the things that was a blessing is Governor Ralph Carr at the time basically said that the people of Japanese ancestry, you were wronged, and you're welcome to come to Colorado and start your life. And that's why we have a substantial Japanese population here in Colorado, because a lot of people knew they were welcomed, and they still had hard times. They were still discriminated against to some extent, but they knew that the governor was behind them.
And for that, the Japanese American community has never forgotten him. His bust is in Sakura Square as a testament to the goodwill that he showed to this embattled and beleaguered community.
My mother said, the prejudice is too strong. So she didn't want to go back to California, she didn't want to go to Chicago, so on and so forth. So she said, Governor Carr has said the Japanese are welcome in Colorado. We're going to Colorado. It was kind of like, I'm going to take the kids and go to Colorado with or without you, you know. And that was, horribly brave for a woman in that era and with two little kids.
Once the war was over, and you know, my grandfather, just word of mouth, heard that Governor Carr was welcoming with open arms the Japanese Americans. And my grandfather heard that right away. He packed up his belongings and his family and came straight here. Pacific Mercantile came about through my grandfather, who actually was interned in the camps. He actually had another store in Sacramento that was, of course, taken away after when the war broke out. I have many good memories of the old store. It was actually on the opposite side, on Larimer Street side, from 1944 to 1972, and then we moved to this location here since 1972.
I'll be back. Okay. I can get you another room 3 if you're ready.
My mom and dad met on a blind date, and it must have went well. They got married in 1955, which was the same year that Disneyland opened. They went to Disneyland for their honeymoon. And this is a picture from, I think it says 1969, which means I would have been 6 years old. So that's me, that's my sister. She's a little over 2 years older than me. My brother's 5 years older than me, and my mom and dad. But, you know, they came out of it and made a life for themselves. So I'm really proud of them. It's a hard thing. It's hard to talk about.
I haven't seen these pictures before, these ones. Great-grandfather. And then there's my Auntie Sachi. I tried to talk to my grandma about it. You know how grandparents are, especially grandmas, are always cheerful, give you hugs, they spoil you rotten. And I remember having a conversation with my grandma one day, it was just her and I at her kitchen table, and I asked her about the camps, and I saw a look come across her face that I had never seen before, and it was one of pain, disgust, anger, and she just shook her head and got up and left the table.
There was very, very little discussion about the camp situation. It was more, it's over with. You know, get on with it. Do the best you can to do what you need to do to survive.
Probably the most poignant thing that my dad ever said was, because I said, what was it like in the camps? And he said, there's a fine line between hope and despair on a daily basis.
Again, the reason for your imprisonment was that you were insufficiently assimilated. When you get that message, when the country gives you that message, there's a powerful incentive to try to do everything in your power to prove that thinking wrong. And so for many Japanese Americans after the war, their primary effort was to prove themselves to be just typical Americans.
My mother was so dead set that I was going to be assimilated into being an American. My brother spoke perfect Japanese when he went to school, and then he had to learn English. And my mother decided that that was not going to happen to me. So I know maybe 5 or 10 words in Japanese, and that's it. And so that was part of moving to North Denver, was to take us away from the Japanese community.
So for many Japanese Americans, being singled out as disloyal was something of a shameful mark against their community and their families. And as a result, many families never spoke of incarceration. And so the stories, the true history, really kind of lay fallow in the ground for decades. As we moved into the era of civil rights and Black power, Japanese Americans, like all other ethnic groups, were watching and understanding the grave injustices that had been done to African Americans. So beginning in the 1970s, a movement for redress and reparations began in the community, and it gained steam as people who had been previously fearful or reticent to share their experiences, even with their own children and grandchildren, began to go public and talk about the trauma that they had experienced in camp.
It dredges up a lot of feelings and a lot of questions like, why? Why would this happen?
And that's the one thing that's really hard to kind of understand, is why didn't anybody else say anything?
You know, and why should you permit something like this to happen in our country, which is supposedly the most democratic, liberal country in the world.
So Japanese Americans lost in terms of lost wages, in terms of lost property, probably about $300 million in 1942 dollars. The current day value of the property that Japanese Americans lost during the war really almost can't be calculated, because in many cases they owned property that would become extravagantly expensive in the years after the war. So, for example, Japanese American strawberry farmers owned vast swaths of land in Orange County, California. There was one Japanese American farmer in Anaheim whose property was on what eventually became Disneyland. So all of these incredibly valuable properties would be worth billions of dollars today, and Japanese Americans lost control of them half a century ago. In 1988, they were able to obtain redress and reparations from the United States government.
Basically, everybody was given $20,000 and a letter saying, we're sorry that this happened. Here's $20,000 reparation, which I give the government credit for doing, but it shouldn't have happened to begin with.
For nearly everyone, the public apology of the government of the United States was far more meaningful than any monetary payment. It felt as if the United States was, for the very first time, acknowledging the absolute injustice that had been visited upon them.
But then, when I was in college, I met people who didn't know about it, and I was shocked that they didn't know, that they never learned about it.
So for Japanese American children, not only were their parents not talking about their experiences, but the curricula, the history, the social studies, the government classes that they were taking really never mentioned or at best whitewashed this history.
I think a lot of what it was is people in power in the government, the United States government, realizing that it was a horrible thing that happened in our history, and instead of learning from it and educating people, I think they tried to downplay it because it was embarrassing and it was horrible. And I think that's why a lot of kids didn't learn about it.
I think it should be taught more in schools, because if we don't learn from our past, then we can't move on into our present. And the fact that some kids have no idea that this happened in America it's kind of disgusting to me, I think, because especially now with everything that's happening, they need to know.
As the population of people who were in camp gets older, as memories fade, as we have fewer witnesses, it's absolutely imperative that we remember these stories.
It's important in as much as we don't want the incarceration and that kind of thing to happen again.
You know when it really hit me was when 9/11 happened. And President Bush, he went to a mosque and really was proactive in saying, let's not all panic, let's be calm, let's make sure we know the facts and not start discriminating against people who look like the people who were responsible for 9/11. So luckily, we didn't have a repeat at that time. I mean, history is repeating itself, and the only way to prevent that from happening is to teach kids in school about history so that they realize if you don't take action for things not to occur again, then it's likely that they will.
It would be tempting to think that something that the United States has apologized for and recognized as wrong could never happen again. But when we think about the causes and the sentiments and the ideas that really made it possible for this to occur, we have to think maybe we're not so far from the past as we would like to hope. The United States has done many great things in its past, and the greatest thing that it can do is to learn from its past mistakes. Today, the Japanese American community in Colorado may be bigger than it's ever been in the past, but it's a different community than it was. By and large, the community does not still live in the area of Denver that was considered to be Japantown. The community is dispersed throughout the Front Range in suburban areas. At the same time, the community remembers its roots and continues to coalesce around institutions like the Denver Buddhist Temple, Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, which continues to exist there in Sakura Square.
So Sakura Square is a square block in downtown Denver. It's between 19th and 20th Streets and Lawrence and Larimer. It has been here since the 70s, on the corner of 20th and Lawrence is the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary 2 years ago. We also have Pacific Mercantile, which is a Japanese grocery store, and they're not just a store. They are part of the fabric of our community.
All my life, I've heard about Grandpa Enei, and just his struggles that he had coming to America, and then his struggles of being interned in camp and having the opportunity of coming to Colorado and being able to start his business all over again. His history and his story and has just all been like really emotional, learning all about it, and really powerful, and it's just made me want to become that next generation for him.
To keep the history of Sakura Square is so important to me on a personal level because of what our grandparents went through.
I should have said this from the very beginning. I really think that I have lived pretty much a charmed life. There have been bad things that happen, but really a lot of good things. I think my mother must have taught me at a very young age. Yeah, 1,000 paper cranes is a lot of folding. Well, Denver is my hometown. It has afforded me a lot of opportunities and a lot of opportunities for my children, mostly. We're getting towards the end. It's hard to really put your finger on, but Denver is more broad-minded and more open, I believe, than most other places that we've lived. I came to value, I think, maybe myself and my heritage, and there we are.
Another one of the original bricks. Preserving the site is proof that it really happened. You know, some people say that the imprisonment of the Japanese Americans was our defining moment or defining history in this country. And I say, no, that's not the truth. Our defining history is that they had that experience, but they didn't let that stop them. And so these trees here were trees that he probably planted. But they never gave up. You know, they used their anger as a motivator to prove, you know, that they were very capable. They were a part of this country, and then, you know, pass that on to us, you know, the generations afterwards. So we're the ones that are benefiting from their sacrifice. And so that's something that is important and that we should never forget.